the goddess who looked down from above. Egypt was as old as the sand underfoot, but Cleopatra was born anew every day. Even at that moment, when her feet touched the marble slabs of Alexandria and the sun seemed to bend lower to lick her cheeks like a lover. The Ptolemaic palace, that temple of rot and splendor, trembled with her footsteps. The walls, decorated with frescoes depicting Ra and Osiris, seemed to be listening to her breathing. And in the gardens, where fountains spat wine instead of water, servants whispered, "She's back. Isis is among us again." But Egypt was rotting. Not only because of the debts owed to Rome, not only because of the brotherly war with Arsinoe, her rival sister, who, like a snake, crawled through the dark corridors, whispering conspiracies. He was rotting because he had forgotten who he was. The gods are gone, leaving the throne without power and the people without faith. Until she showed up. Cleopatra knew that the sword would not save the kingdom. Her father, Ptolemy XII, sold Egypt to Rome before she was born, signing papyri that reeked of mold and fear. But Cleopatra was not one to bargain for crumbs. She didn't ask for mercy. She took everything. One day, the Roman ambassador, his face like a swollen grape, declared that she was too bold for a woman. Cleopatra did not answer. Instead, she touched his arm, and her smile burned his soul like the fire in the temple of Isis. A week later, he left, leaving 2 ships with grain and gold bars as a gift. A month later, he was found dead in a bathtub poison diluted in wine. It was said that her eunuch physician did it, but Cleopatra only shrugged her shoulders when she was told. "Goddesses don't kill," she whispered in the mirror, examining her reflection. There, inspiring. Her palace became a theater where every wall, every carpet, every drop of incense played its part. There were no simple meetings here. Even dinner turned into a ritual. The Roman legates who came to collect taxes left her with empty purses but full eyes. They saw her not just as a woman, but as something more, the embodiment of an eternal mystery that they, the men, had never solved. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra knew that this moment would determine the fate of Egypt. Her brother Ptolemy XIII, a tyrant boy with a face red with envy, was already trying to buy the Romans' favor. But Cleopatra chose a different path. At night, wrapped in a carpet soaked in incense smoke and garlic to scare away demons, she made her way to Caesar's chambers. When the carpet opened, he saw more than just a woman. He saw the future. "I am Isis," she said, and her voice rang like a harp string. "And you're Osiris. We will resurrect Egypt together." Caesar knew it was a lie. He was a Roman, a materialist who believed in legions rather than gods. But what he saw in her eyes wasn't deception, but a power he couldn't explain. He stayed. And when the fire engulfed Alexandria and her brother fled, Caesar stood next to her on the balcony holding her hand. But even a goddess needs allies. Waiting in the shadow of her throne was Arsinoe, the sister she had banished, but who was still returning like the tide. In Rome, the Senate whispered, "This Egyptian which has bewitched Caesar. We need to get her out of here before she makes slaves of us." And in the desert, beyond the borders of the kingdom, prophets roamed, shouting that Cleopatra was not a goddess, but the punishment of the gods for the sins of her kind. One of them, a madman with a scarred face, entered her bedroom while she was sleeping. He had a dagger in his hand, but he couldn't strike. "Your eyes," he croaked as the guards grabbed him. They're burning." Cleopatra smiled. "Then go away. And tell the others I'm not just looking down on you. I see everything." But there were things she didn't see. For example, that Caesar would give her a son whom she would name Caesarion, Little Caesar. Or that one day she would meet Antony, a Roman general whose soul would burn just like hers. Now she was standing on the terrace of the palace, looking at the Nile, which was said to drag the souls of the dead in its current. "You're right," she whispered to the wind. "Egypt was rotting, but I am his heart. And while it's beating, we'll live." Down in the garden, her favorite eunuch doctor was mixing poisons in a golden bowl. He knew that when the time came, Cleopatra would demand them. "But not for myself. For those who dare to stand in her way." "My lady," he said, coming into her. "The Roman ambassadors are waiting in the throne room." "Let them wait," she replied. "Let them learn patience. The goddesses are in no hurry." And at that moment, she really was a goddess. Not because she was called that by priests or sycophantic poets. It was because her presence made the world hold its breath. Her eyes, into which the most powerful men in the world looked, were windows into the abyss, the one where empires fall and myths rise. Her body was an altar, her desires were a sentence. And her palace was a sanctuary of pleasure, where every step, every breath, every look became part of a great game. A game in which the winner got the throne and the loser got eternal darkness. Cleopatra did not need an army. Her weapons were her lips, her voice, and her eyes. And when she looked down from above, the world didn't just tilt. He was burning. Caesar, whom she lured in silks. Caesar entered her chambers like a conqueror. His boots, covered with the dust of roads and the blood of battles, pounded on the marble slabs like a war drum. He came to take it. But Cleopatra knew that whoever entered her world had already lost. The palace was a maze where every corridor, every curtain, every column played a role. The air here was thick with incense, frankincense, myrrh, and something else the Romans didn't know. Here, the shadows did not move as they should. They slithered like snakes, coiling around the thoughts of the guests. And at the center of it all is her. Cleopatra was not waiting for him in the throne room where queens usually receive ambassadors and enemies. She was waiting in a bedroom hung with silks that reflected the light like the surface of the Nile when the moon was full. She had few clothes on, but even less embarrassment. Her body was the map he had to figure out, and her voice was the key to treasures he didn't know he had. She didn't talk about wars, treaties, or taxes. She was talking about eternity. About how Rome, despite its legions and triumphal arches, was afraid of Egypt. Because Egypt was older than the laws, older than the gods the Romans worshipped. Where they built cities, Egypt buried them under the sands. Caesar listened. He looked at her as if she were a mystery that needed to be solved. But he didn't understand, he was already hers. His common sense melted like wax on fire when she touched his hand. His ambitions, which he had previously held in an iron grip, were now in her hands, like dice that she threw at will. When he signed the decree on her ascension to the throne, he thought it was his victory. But in fact, he signed his defeat. He gave her not only power over Egypt, but also over himself. She gave birth to a son by him. The boy she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. The name is like a blade thrust into the heart of Rome. It wasn't just a child. It was a challenge. The promise that Egypt would not become a province and Rome would not become its heir. Everyone knew that if Caesar recognized his son, he would betray the Senate, which was already hissing like a snake, sensing danger. But he admitted it, because Cleopatra made a ritual out of it. She brought the child to the temple of Isis, and the priests shouted that it was a sign of the gods. And Caesar, standing next to her, felt his own flesh becoming part of the myth she was creating. His friends in Rome were whispering, "She bewitched him. This is the curse of Egypt. We need to get her out of here before she makes slaves of us." But Caesar did not hear them. He only saw her. And when he brought her to Rome, settled her in his house on the Palatine, and allowed himself to be called his wife in the eyes of those who dared to look, it was the final blow. The Romans hated her. They called her a witch, a robber, a parasite that drains the strength from their empire. But they didn't understand. Cleopatra didn't want Rome. She wanted his soul. She walked through the streets like a goddess among the ants. Her stretcher, decorated with gold, left a trail that people followed like a meteor. And when she entered the halls of the Senate without saying a word, she saw even the proudest patricians shrink, because they felt that she looked at them as if they were history that could be rewritten. One of the senators, an old man with a face streaked with wrinkles, once said, "Do you think you control us? You're just a toy in the hands of a man who can crush you like a midge." Cleopatra smiled. "You're wrong. I don't control you. You obeyed me because I am your fear. You're afraid of what you can't understand. And I am a mystery that you will never solve." After that, the senator went to the provinces and never returned. But even the goddess needed allies. Waiting in the shadow of her throne was Arsinoe, the sister she had banished, but who was still returning like the tide. In Rome, the Senate whispered, "This Egyptian which has bewitched Caesar, we need to get her out of here before she makes slaves of us." And in the desert, beyond the borders of the kingdom, prophets roamed, shouting that Cleopatra was not a goddess, but the punishment of the gods for the sins of her kind. One of them, a madman with a scarred face, entered her bedroom while she was sleeping. He had a dagger in his hand, but he couldn't strike. "Your eyes," he croaked as the guards grabbed him. They're burning." Cleopatra smiled. "Then go away and tell the others. I'm not just looking down on you. I see everything." But there were things she didn't see. For example, that Caesar would give her a son, whom she would name Caesarion, Little Caesar. Or that one day she would meet Antony, a Roman general whose soul would burn just like hers. Now she was standing on the terrace of the palace, looking at the Nile, which was said to drag the souls of the dead in its current. "You're right," she whispered to the wind. "Egypt was rotting, but I am his heart, and while it's beating, we'll live." Down in the garden, her favorite eunuch doctor, was mixing poisons in a golden bowl. He knew that when the time came, Cleopatra would demand them. But not for myself, for those who dare to take her path. "My lady," he said, coming into her, "the Roman ambassadors are waiting in the throne room." "Let them wait," she replied. "Let them learn patience. The goddesses are in no hurry." And at that moment, she really was a goddess. Not because she was called that by priests or sycophantic poets. It was because her presence made the world hold its breath. Her eyes, into which the most powerful men in the world looked, were windows into the abyss, the one where empires fall and myths rise. Her body was an altar, her desires were a sentence, and her palace was a sanctuary of pleasure, where every step, every breath, every look became part of a great game, a game in which the winner got the throne and the loser got eternal darkness. Cleopatra did not need an army. Her weapons were her lips, her voice, and her eyes. And when she looked down from above, the world didn't just tilt. He was burning. And Caesar, who thought he had subjugated Egypt, found himself trapped, from which he could not escape, because he didn't just lose his common sense. He lost himself. He returned to Rome, but his soul remained in Alexandria, trapped in the silks of her bedroom. He tried to rule the empire, but every decree, every order, every decision was an imprint of her will. When he fell in the tomb of Pompey, pierced by the knives of the senators, his last words were not about Rome. They were about her. "Et of tu, brute? What is it?" he whispered. But if he could have spoken, he would have said, "Et tu, Cleopatra?" Because she was the end of it. Not because she betrayed him, but because she made him weak. Cleopatra found out about his death 3 days later. She was standing on the seashore, where the waves were beating against the rocks like a heart that couldn't stop. "He's gone," she told the eunuch. "Yes, mistress." "Then let's start again." Because she knew it wasn't over. This is just the beginning. Rome was wounded. The Senate is split. The empire was trembling. And in this chaos, she saw her future. She wasn't crying. Instead, she picked up a mirror and looked at her reflection. "I am Isis," she whispered, "and I'm not done yet." Somewhere far away in Rome, young Octavian, Caesar's nephew, looked at his uncle's body and thought, "I will destroy her. I will make her name disappear from history." But Cleopatra knew that the names of the goddesses do not disappear. They live in the sands, in the winds, in legends. And when she closed the mirror, she knew that the next step was already waiting for her. The next man who would come to win her over. The next game she's going to play. The next empire she burns down. Cleopatra knew that the throne was not based on gold, but on fear. Every stone of the Ptolemaic palace was soaked with it, like the sand of the Nile with water. Fear was her army, her priests, her gods. She didn't build fortresses out of stone, she built them out of silence. Her web of secrets spread across Alexandria like a spider's web stretched between the pillars of a temple. Every thread led to her. The servants, paddling the springs in the fountains, whispered about what they had heard in the bedrooms of the masters. The eunuchs who served wine at the feasts memorized every word, every smile, every glance, too long or too fast. Even the slaves, whose lives seemed as priceless as sand, were her eyes and ears. The courtiers were disappearing. They did not appear at the morning councils, did not appear on the balconies from where the crowd watched. Their names were erased like dust from papyrus. Someone said they were taken away by the demons of the desert. Others whispered that Cleopatra turned enemies into statues, turning flesh into stone with spells learned from the priests of Isis. But the truth was simpler and scarier. They were just dying. One of them, a young nobleman named Theodotus, allowed himself to laugh at her behind the heavy silk curtains. He joked about her nose, which was too long, like that of the pharaohs, and about her voice, which, in his words, sounds like a chariot grinding on stone. The joke cost him more than he could have imagined. 3 days later, he was found in a water tank, his face was blue, and a piece of cloth soaked in opium was sticking out of his throat. No one dared to ask who gave the order. The women who were laughing behind her back weren't laughing anymore. Some of them lost their voices. The poison, drop by drop, turned their screams into a wheeze. Others suddenly lost their minds, wandering through gardens, talking to shadows. One of them, Arsinoe, her brother's former concubine, disappeared after boasting that she knew a secret that could destroy Cleopatra. A week later, fishermen found her body in the Nile. Her hands were tied with rope, and the sign of Set, the god of chaos, was carved on her forehead. Cleopatra learned the language of poison the same way others learned to read. She knew which powder would make the heart stop for an hour and which would make death look like an illness. She understood how to mix herbs with wine to keep the taste sweet and the poison invisible. Her eunuch doctor, a man with a face like a scorpion, kept recipes in his head which no one dared to open. But the poison was only part of her weapon. The rumors were much scarier. Cleopatra knew how to shoot them like arrows and watch them pierce into the hearts of her enemies. She knew that one word was enough for a neighbor to start suspecting a friend and a husband to doubt his wife's fidelity. One day, she whispered in the ear of one of her generals that his son was planning to kill him in his sleep. A week later, the father killed his son with his own hands, shouting that he was a sorcerer. Her bedroom became an altar where people, not animals, were sacrificed. Every night I spent with her could be my last. The men to whom she gave affection lost their heads, not in a figurative sense. One day, she invited a Roman tribune who refused to pay taxes. In the morning, he was found dead in the garden. His body was covered with bruises, and in his hand was a letter written in his own handwriting, in which he confessed to treason. But Cleopatra didn't just kill. Every murder was part of a game she was playing with fate. She destroyed those who interfered with her plans or those who could be used as victims to intimidate others. Her palace was a maze where every step could lead to life or death. The eunuch healer, her shadow, and executioner walked the corridors like a ghost. He knew that Cleopatra would not forgive a mistake. Once he gave the wrong poison and the woman died too quickly before she could tell everything she knew. Cleopatra did not punish him. Instead, she told him to watch slaves flay a living person until he died of pain. It was a lesson. There were no innocent people in her bedroom. Only convenient and superfluous ones. The convenient ones were those who served her goals either through fear, devotion, or love. The superfluous ones are those who could be removed to make room for new toys. Cleopatra knew that her sister Arsinoe was alive. She wandered somewhere beyond the borders of Egypt, gathering supporters, whispering conspiracies in the ears of those who hated her. But Cleopatra was not afraid. She waited, because I knew Arsinoe would come back sooner or later. And then she would destroy it the way she had destroyed all her enemies, slowly, with pleasure, with a taste of victory. One night Cleopatra stood on the terrace, looking up at the stars. The wind was playing with her hair, and down in the garden the eunuch healer was finishing his work. He was dripping poison into a wine cup meant for one of her advisors who had begun to know too much. "Are you happy with yourself?" "What is it?" she asked without turning around. The eunuch froze. He knew that any answer could be the last. "I do your bidding, mistress." "Good, because if you make a mistake, you'll be next." He bowed in silence and disappeared into the shadows. Cleopatra smiled. She knew that her network of secrets was not just an instrument of power. This is her life. Without her, she would have collapsed like a sand castle under the tide. But it wasn't going to collapse, because there were no innocent people in her palace. Only convenient and superfluous ones. And she is a goddess who looked down from above, saw everything, and decided who would live and who would die. And when the wind brought the smell of death from the banks of the Nile, Cleopatra closed her eyes and inhaled it like incense. "Alexandria," she whispered, "you're mine." And the city responded with silence, because I knew she was telling the truth. Cleopatra knew that Mark Antony was coming. She was waiting for him, like a hunter waiting for prey that walks into a trap on its own. He was different from Caesar. Not an old lion tired of war, but a young tiger who has not yet realized that his teeth are becoming dull from excess. Caesar was the shield that protected her kingdom. Antony will be the sword that will destroy him. But Cleopatra knew that even a sword could be broken if it was properly sharpened. He arrived in Tarsus, a city by the river where the air was thick with the smell of spices and fear. Where other queens would have sent envoys, Cleopatra came on her own. Her ship, decorated with gold and purple, sailed through the waters like a living sun. The sails smelled of incense, and the sounds of flutes and lyres poured from the deck. She stood in the bow, Isis, the goddess of fertility and death, dressed in clothes that shimmered like the skin of a snake. Antony sat on the throne, surrounded by his officers, but his eyes were fixed on her. He thought he was calling her to court. In fact, he was already hers. She didn't play power games. Instead, she offered him a feast that he would never forget. Wine flowed freely, dishes were bursting with abundance, and slaves dressed like gods danced to the sound of drums. Cleopatra sat next to him, touching his arm as she spoke and laughing as if she knew secrets he would die to hear. She hadn't asked him for an alliance. She made it clear to him that he was already a part of her. Antony was a warrior, but in her arms he became a child. She taught him to drink wine from cups decorated with rubies, to eat dates in which honey and poison were embedded, and to dance in temples where priests sang hymns to her name. She made a god out of him, but a god who did not know that his power was an illusion. He thought he was conquering her, but she was actually conquering him. His first gift was the kingdom of Armenia. He gave it to her like a man giving a flower to a woman he loves. This was followed by the territories of Syria, Cyprus, and parts of Asia Minor. Cleopatra accepted them with a smile, as if they were trophies that had always belonged to her. She named herself the Queen of Kings and Caesarion, the heir of the universe. Antony laughed when he heard these words. He did not understand that she was already building a new empire, not Rome, not Egypt, but something third, where she would be the only god. But Rome did not forget. Octavian, Caesar's nephew, watched them from afar like a spider watching flies in a spider's web. He knew that Antony had lost his mind. He knew that Cleopatra had turned him into a doll dancing to her music. And he waited. Cleopatra continued to play. She held a ritual in the temple of Isis, where Antony donned the robes of Osiris and she donned the robes of the goddess. They lay on the altar surrounded by candles, and the servants shouted that they were reviving the ancient bond between heaven and earth. But it wasn't magic. It was a hoax. She didn't believe in gods. She was them. His troops began to whisper. The legionnaires who had followed him without question before were now doubtful. They saw how he lost interest in battles, how he spent his days at feasts and his nights in the arms of a woman who was called a witch. One of the commanders, an old veteran, said, "We came here to conquer, and he's dancing in silks." Cleopatra knew about it. She knew that discontent was a weapon that could be used. She sent gifts to the officers, gold and promises, and to those who did not agree, poison and wine. When the war with Rome began, Antony was no longer the same man who had once conquered Gaul. He thought of Cleopatra, of her body, of her voice, of the way she looked at him when he told her of his plans. At the Battle of Actium, he stood on the deck of his ship, watching the battle that was to decide the fate of the empires. But his eyes weren't looking for the enemy. They were looking for her. Cleopatra was on board next to him. When her ship turned back, leaving the battlefield, Antony followed her like a sleepy man following the light. He didn't know why she was leaving. He only knew that he couldn't be without her. After the defeat, they fled to Alexandria. There Cleopatra continued to play. She said that they would still win, that Rome would fall, that their son would become king of the world. Antony believed. He believed even when Octavian's troops approached the walls of the city. But when Antony found out that Cleopatra was dead, or so he was told, he plunged a sword into his own chest. He died slowly, praying that he would be brought to her. When he saw her alive, he smiled and said, "I can leave now." But Cleopatra did not cry. She knew that his death was part of her plan. She knew Octavian would come to see her, to try to break her. But she was ready. Her palace became a tomb where every step was part of a ritual. She put on her best jewelry, dressed in purple like a goddess, and waited. When Octavian entered, he saw not the defeated queen, but a living legend. "You will live," he said. "I'm already dead," she replied. And when the poison touched her skin, she smiled. Because she knew that her name would live on in the songs, in the legends, in the nightmares of those who dared to stand up to her. Antony was the second, but not the last. Others will come for him. But Cleopatra knew that no one would repeat her path. Because she wasn't just a woman. She was a force that could not be understood, could not be defeated, could not be forgotten. Her body was an altar, her desires were a sentence. And her story is an eternal war where the winner always pays the price. Cleopatra knew that luxury was not just a pleasure, it was a weapon. Her feasts were not just celebrations, but rituals where every sip of wine, every glance, every caress became part of a great game. The Alexandrian palace turned into a maze where guests wandered between pleasure and death, not knowing what awaits them behind the next door. There were no random people here. Everyone who entered the banquet halls played a role, whether it was a victim, a spectator, or a performer. The halls were decorated so that even the gods would envy. The walls were covered with silks that shimmered like the surface of the Nile in the moonlight. The floors were covered with rose petals mixed with ground pearls to make each step of the guests soft but expensive. The fountains poured not water, but wine, diluted with honey and spices, and the air was thick with incense, frankincense, myrrh, and something else that no one could name. The priests of Isis said that it was the smell of eternity itself. There was no simple entertainment at Cleopatra's feasts. Not only humans danced here, but also animals trained by eunuch mentors. Lions clad in golden armor circled in a circle, and peacocks, whose tails were studded with rubies, spread their feathers to the sound of flutes. But the main performance took place at the tables where Cleopatra watched her guests lose their minds. Naked slaves served dishes that were not seen even in the homes of Roman patricians. Pigeons stuffed with emerald dust, fish caught on the same day and seasoned with poisons that did not kill but awakened strange visions. Men and women, chosen for their beauty and ability to remain silent, became part of the decor. Their bodies decorated the hall like statues, but alive, breathing, responding to the touch of the guests. Cleopatra did not take part in the feasts immediately. She appeared later when the wine had already warmed up the blood and the minds were clouded. Her appearance was like a bolt from the blue. She entered dressed in fabrics that seemed to be made of the moon, and her voice rang like a harp string. The guests fell silent. Even the musicians stopped, not daring to break the silence that she created with one glance. She did not talk about politics, did not propose alliances. Instead, she asked questions that made the faces of the guests turn pale. "Do you love your wife?" "What is it?" she asked one of the nobles whose hand was shaking from the wine. "Yes, mistress," he replied, trying not to look into her eyes. "Then why did you buy a slave to play her role in your dreams?" He froze and Cleopatra smiled. "Don't be afraid. I'm not judging. We all play games. Some are better, others are worse." The games continued all night. Sometimes they were harmless, dancing, singing, arguing about philosophy. But sometimes they turned into trials. One day, she invited her guests to compete in who could drink more poison diluted in wine. The poison was weak, but enough to cause hallucinations. Those who lost consciousness first became the objects of ridicule. Those who persevered to the end received gifts, gold bars or slaves whom she personally chose. But there were other games, darker ones. One night Cleopatra ordered a large basin filled with milk and honey to be brought. 10 male and female slaves were lowered into it, bound with ropes. They should have drowned, but not immediately. Each guest received a dagger with which he could cut the rope of one of the slaves. But if he was wrong, he became a victim himself. The feast turned into a deadly lottery where every step was a game with fate. Cleopatra watched from the terrace, sipping wine from a golden bowl. Her physician eunuch stood by her side, ready to do whatever she ordered. "They think it's a game," she said, looking at the guests, who were laughing and shouting as they watched the drowning. "This is the game, mistress," he replied. "Only they don't know the rules." She smiled. "The rules are simple. Those I choose will survive. The rest will become part of the legend." Rumors of her feasts reached Rome like waves that never stopped. Senators whispered in dark halls that Cleopatra was not just a queen, but a witch who devoured souls. Octavian, young and ambitious, listened to these stories, but did not believe them. He thought that all these were exaggerations, tools of fear that she was inflating herself. But one day, one of her former guests came to him, a man who had spent 3 days in her palace and survived. He was pale, his hands were shaking, and his eyes were staring at nothing. "She's not human," he whispered. "She's a shadow that absorbs light." "What did she do to you?" "Nothing. I was just watching. She watched me lose myself." Octavian didn't question him further. He realized that Cleopatra was more dangerous than he had thought. But even in Rome, there were those who wanted her. The young patricians, whose hearts were burning with a thirst for adventure, dreamed of coming to Alexandria to see it, touch it, be a part of its world. They wrote poems about her eyes, about her body, about how she laughs, playing with men like a cat with a mouse. One of them, a poet named Lucius, came to Egypt to dedicate an epic poem to her. He thought his words would charm her, but Cleopatra did not read his poems. Instead, she offered him a challenge. He had to spend the night in a room with gods painted on the walls and a statue of Isis in the center. In the morning, he was found dead. His arms were torn out of their sockets, and in his throat was a piece of paper with his own poem. Her servants whispered that it was a ritual, that Cleopatra sacrificed people to the gods in order to maintain her power. But the eunuch healer knew the truth. She did not believe in the gods. She just played with people like with dolls, creating stories that will live on for centuries. But even her allies were afraid of her. Antony, who had given her everything, lands, troops, honor, sometimes wondered what kind of power he had set free. He saw how she looked at her enemies, how they trembled under her gaze, how they lost their minds. He felt that even he was part of her game, that his victories and defeats were not his choice, but her will. And the enemies? They wanted her, not because they wanted her body, but because they wanted to understand her. They wanted to solve a mystery that eluded everyone who tried. They dreamed of becoming a part of her world, even knowing that it could cost their lives. Cleopatra knew that her feasts were not just entertainment. It was a way to rule. She created a myth about herself that was stronger than armies or laws. People weren't just afraid of her. They believed in her. They believed that she was a goddess, a demon, an angel of death. And this faith made her invincible. As she stood on the terrace, looking at the Nile, she thought not of Rome, not of Egypt, but of eternity. That her name would live on in the songs, in the legends, in the nightmares of those who dared to stand up to her. Her body was an altar, her desires were a sentence, and her feasts are an eternal war, where the winner always pays the price. And when the wind brought the smell of death from the banks of the Nile, Cleopatra closed her eyes and inhaled it like incense. "Alexandria," she whispered, "you're mine." And the city responded with silence, because I knew she was telling the truth. When the goddess loses her face, she was used to the thrill, the way the air freezes when she enters, the way men lose their voices when they look into her eyes. She was a queen, a priestess, a seductress. Her body is diplomacy. Her voice is the music of war. She did not need armies. Her victories were measured not by territories, but by size. That was the case with Caesar. That was the case with Antony. She didn't seduce. She allowed herself to be conquered. This is how men thought they were winning while they were losing themselves. Her strength wasn't in the crown, but in the fact that the crown was just one of her outfits. But now, the crown was falling. Octavian entered Alexandria not as a lover, but as a judge. He wasn't carrying flowers. He carried the cold. Marble, clean, ruthless. He wasn't like the men she knew. There was no desire in his gaze, just the calculation. Not a man, but a calculating machine in the guise of an emperor. She greeted him as she had once greeted Caesar, in silks, the scent of incense and roses, to the sounds of harps and flutes. Her face is flawless as always. Her gait is smooth like a jaguar's. She was expecting a tremor. Fading. Sparks. He chuckled. "You're getting old, Cleopatra," he said. "And your tricks too." Those words hit harder than any of the legions. She suddenly realized that her era was ending. Everything she had been building collapsed in one grin. Antony was dead. He died in her arms, cursing and worshipping. His blood hadn't dried on the stone yet, and she was already being judged. Egypt was left without allies. Her son by Caesar is a dangerous living symbol who will soon be killed. Her yard was as quiet as an animal before a storm. Her servants no longer bowed, but shunned. She was no longer a goddess. She was a fallen actress on a stage where the audience was tired of the performance. She tried again. She received Octavian in her chambers, barefoot with her body smeared with incense in a transparent cloth. It wasn't passion that was trembling in her voice, but fear. But Octavian just walked by. It's like walking past a statue. It was as if she was part of the architecture. Indifference was her verdict. Her bedroom, once a sanctuary of victories, has turned into a waiting room. She listened as Roman soldiers approached her door. I heard the seals being lifted, how they whisper about her execution. No more love letters were written to her, only denunciations. They no longer brought jewelry, only lists of debts. She wasn't crying. Tears are the luxury of the living. She stood in front of the mirror, looking into the eyes of the woman the whole world called a goddess. But the goddess was a frightened woman with wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, cracks in her voice, and hands that no longer trembled with desire, but only from the cold. She remembered the night she first put on the tiara. Then her fingers trembled with delight. Today it's out of desperation. Then she looked at herself with admiration. Today, with pity. She realized that her weapon was outdated. Temptation no longer saved. The time for women winning through bed was passing. The time of steel was coming. Octavian didn't want affection, he wanted order. He wanted a story that didn't have Cleopatra in it. But she didn't want to be a line. She wanted to be a tragedy. That was the night she chose the poison. Not a dagger, it's too rude. Not a loop, it's too pathetic. And what kills is quiet. How a dream dies. She ordered a snake to be brought, the one that would become her symbol. Legend has it that she kissed her as she had once kissed Caesar. With tenderness, with determination, with longing. When they found her, she was lying on a pedestal. Beautiful, silent, defeated, but not conquered. Octavian stood by her body for a long time. They say he was silent. Perhaps for the first time I felt respect. Or fear. Or just the emptiness of the fact that history has lost its brightest flame. Cleopatra did not die like a queen. She died as a symbol. The last woman who held Rome not with a sword, but with her eyes. Not by orders, but by touch. And the loser, because it's always easier for men to forgive a sword than a passion. A tomb where silence breathes. Where flutes used to sound, now only the echo lives. Where silks glided on marble, now the sand whispers of the past. In the tomb where she rests, even the stones are silent with reverence. Because there's not just a dead queen here. It's a dead era here. Cleopatra left no paintings, no treatises, no letters to her descendants. She left word of mouth. A whisper of mingled delight and disgust, admiration and fear. Who was she? Crazy? Brilliant? Promiscuous? Or is she just the only one who dared to play a man's game with her own rules? Octavian ordered her image to be erased. The coins with her profile have been melted down. The frescoes are worn out. The maids were executed. The sun is strangled. History has been rewritten. But the women were still whispering her name in the dark. Courtesans are like prayer. Empresses as a threat. Men are like a warning. She has become a myth. The poison hidden in the smile. A woman who was more convenient to blame than to understand. Rome wrote the history of the victors. Egypt remained silent. And between them, in the dust of centuries, she lay. Not as a victim, and not as a criminal, but as a question. What is scarier for the world, a woman who loves, or a woman who cannot be conquered? Cleopatra's crypt was never found. It was as if death itself was ashamed to touch her. It was as if even she understood, such people don't die, they fall silent, so that someday they can enter the hall again and make the air tremble again.